Hi, my name is Kasak Alkalaf, and I'm in section AO3. For my self-introduction, I'm a first-generation college student and immigrant from Iraq. Growing up in two different parts of the world and embracing two different cultures and languages has heavily influenced my societal perspectives and shaped my opinion on topics such as misogyny, privilege, representation, and systematic inequality. My positionality can also be understood through my strong beliefs in human rights and support for the liberation of marginalized and occupied communities and countries. For the retrospective analysis, I'll first be focusing on Week 8. One important concept from the Week 8 material that I learned is that the logic of elimination is a driving force for many settler colonists in order to gain land and resources for the price of indigenous peoples' cultures, traditions, and essentially their lives. The logic of elimination is a continuous process that aims to cumulatively eliminate indigenous communities and populations from their land and instead replace them with frameworks that reflect settler superiority. I believe that understanding this concept is important because it helps us to recognize that there are systems of power put in place for the purpose of economical and political benefits of the rich white settlers, while such systems, on the other hand, also tend to harm cultural and indigenous populations. This concept is applicable even today in many places around the world, and notably in Palestine, where Israeli forces are using means of genocide to completely wipe out indigenous Palestinians and take their land. On the note of genocide, I wanted to point out how Wolf clearly states that although settler colonialism and genocide have converged, they, quote, should be distinguished. Settler colonialism is inherently eliminatory but not invariably genocidal. I believe that Wolf means that settler colonialism differs from genocide because it encompasses a much larger scope of practices in order to achieve its desired outcomes. A quote from the text that reflects the superiority of the settlers is, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Wolf highlights how the indigenous are viewed as inferior and not worthy of basic human rights, which legitimizes their need for eradication and land extraction. In class, we discussed how the logic of elimination is rooted from many different points of views and beliefs, including the notion of white dominance and superiority, as well as the greed for economic prosperity through the means of land extraction and land expansion and extraction. One example from the lecture slides that relates to the logic of elimination and such beliefs is the doctrine of terra nullius, which stands for land belonging to no one. This principle was used by the British when they colonized and marginalized the indigenous people of Australia, claiming the indigenous Australians were not deserving of the land, and thus it was justified for them to instead occupy that land themselves. Wolf reinforces how settlers resorted to ridiculous means for the sake of making their wrongs seem right. This reveals a theme of power and how power in the wrong hands can be very detrimental and have detrimental effects on indigenous communities. And then I also chose to focus on Week 10. One important concept from the Week 10 material that I learned is that although globalization could be beneficial for the economy, it often brings with it waves of different cultural practices that aim to replace and leave out those already existing. Globalization is a process in which the world's businesses and economies merge to work together and become established on an international scale. Lowe, however, has a more profound definition of this term, stating that it is a, quote, condition of economic, social, and political interdependence across cultures, societies, nations, and religions, precipitated by an unprecedented expansion of capitalism on a larger scale. From her definition, I can understand that globalization affects everyday life on a much larger scale than I had once believed. I think that recognizing how globalization can both positively impact communities while also causing harm to such said communities is imperative. This is because globalization heavily affects not only people in economical aspects, but also in ways that interfere with their identities and cultures and traditions. Truthfully, when I read and learned about Lisa Lowe's globalization reading, I was intrigued because when I first hear the term globalization, my mind automatically points to the economy instead of how it can personally affect people's lives. Lowe examines how globalization should be looked at as a, quote, structure of feeling instead of merely an economic and political system of being. In this way, culture expresses dynamic contradictions precisely at those intersections, borders, and zones where normative regimes enlist, restrict, or coerce. Normative regimes such as societal norms can be consequential in that they can restrict people from following their traditional cultures and instead following along in what everyone else is doing as a result of globalization. An example of such consequence of globalization from the lecture is the spread of technologies, especially how the advancement of technology has led to less job availability in less advanced countries, meaning that the jobs that once used to be done by hand are now being replaced by machines. In lecture, it is also mentioned how, because of this, there has been an increase in Mexican immigration to the US for the sake of job opportunity and availability. And for the last section, the personal impact reflection, the major topic that impacted me the most was the contested territories and landless belonging, which I also discussed in the week 8 material. This topic was the most impactful to me because as an immigrant who had to leave my country because of war and displacement, I can definitely understand the struggle for autonomy and independence and how this issue can affect people's lives, both in the past, present, and in the future. This topic also resonates with me the most because it is persistent till this day, as seen in many Middle Eastern countries, and thus it is always a topic in the back of my mind and discussed in my household. That's it.